Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
A couple of ground rules. Our basic request is this is a place to eat, drink, and listen. If you want to eat, drink, and talk, you should get a seat inside, a table inside. Is that okay? Because it really is distracting with all the sounds around, and it really helps if we can just try to. So if somebody starts whispering in your ear, just hold up a hand and say, "Ask me later," and that'll help us out. Second is we're going to just have a conversation, and in front of all of you, you're welcome to eavesdrop. We may have time for some questions and discussion at the end, but I'm going to just make a decision on the fly about that. We're going to start with some introductions, and this introduction is especially for my conversation partners, Stuart and Ani. In some ways, I have an advantage that I know a lot more about them than they know about me. But this might be some information some of you all don't know about me either. But I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian setting. I grew up in a little sect called the Plymouth Brethren. How many of you are there any other Plymouth Brethren people here? And Garrison Keillor grew up Plymouth Brethren, and if you've ever read his books where he talks about the sanctified brethren, that was my people. The Plymouth Brethren tried to go through a rebranding a few years ago to call themselves Christian Brethren, and a friend of mine said, yeah, they're the only group who would keep the chauvinistic part of their name and drop the interesting part of their name. But it was a wonderful upbringing. We really learned the Bible. There was a lot of love, and I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for that upbringing. But I'll tell you, my upbringing, I had only one responsibility if I were standing with two people of other faiths, and that would be to tell them that they're going to hell and that they needed to join my religion if they wanted to avoid that. And that was really the context I grew up in. But I received a double message. I also read these verses in the Bible that said you're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself. And it seemed I didn't want people telling me that God hated me unless I joined their religion. And so I really was stuck, on that. It was a struggle for me. I went on to become a college English teacher, and my specialty was philosophical literature. I taught English for some years in higher education. But during that time, I was on my way out of the Christian faith. And then I had a kind of a dramatic turnaround and kind of rediscovered my faith. And ended up becoming a pastor. I was part of a little house church that formed, and ended up leaving teaching and being a pastor for 24 years just outside of Washington, D.C. While I was a pastor, I then went through another period of having to rethink. In some ways, I'd been born a fundamentalist, and I became an evangelical, if some of you would know what that means. But I started asking questions that didn't even work in my evangelical framework, at least that I had inherited. So I'll just tell you, it's not easy to be a pastor and have your faith fall apart on you when you have to keep, acting like you know the answers.
Standing at the podium.
Yeah, exactly. But I was very fortunate to be part of a community where I was allowed to be who I was and go through my questioning. And in fact, some of my friends are here who are part of that community. I started writing books in the middle of all of this, and I left the pastorate 7 years ago, just to be a writer and speaker full time. A big part of my transition was growing in my concern for social activism, and so one of the nice things about my life now is I get to write and speak, and whatever free time I have, I'm able to invest that in a number of causes that matter a great deal to me. I'm a little bit emotional, to be honest with you, about doing this session, and this will allow me to introduce the next person who's going to introduce herself. But I just had a chance to be up at Ani Zonneveld's session. And Ani is a Muslim and a leader, a courageous and creative leader of a progressive Muslim movement. And the reason I followed her work for a long time, but it was very emotional for me to be up there listening, because there are a number of us who fit in this category, but I am one of the people who had been dreaming of the Wild Goose Festival for a long time. In fact, many of you met Carla Iaconelli, who's one of the people who this is happening because of her. And Carla and her deceased husband, Mike Iaconelli, and I were sitting in a gathering in England at an event called Greenbelt. It's a lot like this. I don't know how many years ago it was, and it was late at night, and I can't remember what we were drinking, but we said, we're going to do this in the U.S., and that was a pivotal moment. Well, at that event in Greenbelt, the first time I was invited to speak there, I don't know what it was, 2000, maybe 2003, I'm not good with dates. And I arrived the day before I had to speak. I'd never been to anything like Wild Goose or Greenbelt before. And so I had some free time, and nobody knew who I was, and there were 23,000 people there, and literally I maybe knew 4 people out of the 23. This might be how you guys feel being here. But I was just walking around, and there was this session meeting. So I went and stood in the back of the session. And the speaker in the session was a woman, French, Muslim, feminist, anti-globalism activist. And she was talking about anti-globalism from a French feminist Muslim perspective. And I just thought to myself, I've never been at an ostensibly Christian gathering where I would hear something like this. And that was the moment for me. I remember there was a couple hundred people, maybe about like this. I was standing at the back of the room, and I thought, we need something like this in the U.S. And so when I was listening to you earlier, Ani, I just had this sort of rush of emotion, and I just thought, it's kind of happening. And that's a good place for me to introduce you.
Thanks. Well, you know, I think I can just piggyback right on Wild Goose, and maybe we can just set up a segment next year as a Progressive Muslims, activity, and we can start there. How's that? So the Progressive Muslim movement that I founded and run is called Muslims for Progressive Values. Before I go any further, I'd like to know how many of you were at my talk earlier on. So 20% of you. To touch base on what Brian just said about being honest, because that's essentially what he said. Here he was a pastor, and he was having the difficulty of being that pastor when his belief system was changing. And I do interfaith work, and I've met pastors, evangelical pastors in particular, where they'll be brutally honest about how they think there are many paths to salvation, and being a Muslim, I was not condemned to hell, but what they preach at the podium is very different. And I think and because of the church structure is the way it is, it perpetuates that, because this is a livelihood that they have to keep up with, right? It's bread and butter, it supports your family. So I just wanted to say that I think it's very commendable to be, and it's not easy to be honest, and especially when you're dealing with matters of faith and dealing with matters of life in general. The straight path, as in the Quran, my interpretation is being honest with yourself, your identity, what you stand for, and that is always a challenge. But as a progressive Muslim, my journey was 9/11. I think that was a turning point for many of the Muslims in America in particular. For me, it was a gut-wrenching exercise. I decided conscientiously, and I remember it like it was yesterday, where I said to myself, okay, I got to relearn Islam. And in the process of doing it, if I leave Islam, so be it. If I become closer to Islam, then so be it. And what I discovered was that the Quran that I was reading and the interpretation of that Quran, that sacred text, I found it to be more liberating. I found that the Islam that I was raised in is this small, right? And I think we all were raised in whatever faith tradition in a small little box. And And everybody, and if in Malaysia they teach you a particular strand of Islam, and in Afghanistan and Iran and wherever it is that you go, everyone teaches that political system, that religious institution, only wants to teach you this particular to fit you in that box. And being in America, and the beauty about being in America is you have the liberty to read whatever the hell you want and make the decision based on that. There's freedom of expression and the freedom to read. There's no censorship here. And that is the most powerful thing that America gives to the world. And don't take that for granted. As an immigrant, I'm telling you, don't take that for granted. And having that liberty is, now I start sounding like a Tea Party, liberty. No, I mean real liberty, as in having that freedom to really read and express yourself and not be boxed in is the foundation for what makes us better human beings. And for me, when I look at Islam, this is how my philosophy of Islam. There are Muslims who want to put you in a box, whereas Islam was meant to lift you out of that box. And I think a lot of our faith traditions, that's what it's supposed to do to you.
Amen? So, Stuart, tell us about yourself.
Hello. I'm Stuart Davis. And you guys feel it's awesome to be here. This is so great. I feel happy. Brian, it was really great to be introduced to you through that opening set of paragraphs, because I'm from Minnesota originally. There are some Minnesotans here, aren't there, right? Great, all the lakes, we keep the lakes. I was raised in a Protestant Lutheran home, essentially fundamentalist. And I have a lot of very, very positive things to say about that at this point in my life, actually, because with retrospect, I understand how safe and contained and protected I was by that environment. While I was in it, not so much. Couldn't see that so clearly. But as time has gone on, and I migrated around not only the planet, but its belief systems and spiritual methodologies, my appreciation for my roots has grown very much. And that sort of culminated this past year when my father passed away, who was fundamentalist Christian, and I was with him during his passing, and our spiritual lives intersected in a way that I didn't think was possible. So to jump back a bit from that, when I migrated out of the Lutheran background that I was from, I had a general distaste and frustration with a lot of things that I couldn't identify or articulate, but most of them had to do with beliefs and intermediaries and a host of things of that nature that I had a real allergy toward. I'm an artist by trade and disposition and constitution, and so I tend to keep things very much in flux, and I like to live within the question and not knowing. And so the Christianity that I was raised in gave me an inaccurate perception of what was possible and perhaps what was even true, or the core and essence of Christianity, which I now feel to be much more mysterious. I left and I encountered Zen Buddhism, and I was very spiritually promiscuous for a long time, and still am to some extent. I went through Sufism and Christianity and Buddhism and Hinduism, and formed very lasting, incredible friendships and bonds with people in each of those traditions. But when I found Zen, I knew the first time I walked into a Zendo that I was home. And interestingly, through Zen Buddhism, I was reintroduced by Zen Buddhists to esoteric Christianity. And I formed a friendship with Brother Wayne Teasdale, who some of you may know, and Father Thomas Keating, who is based out of Snowmass, Colorado, which is close to where I live. And I gained an experiential encounter with the similarities and the parallels and the congruencies between the meditation practices that I was using in Zen Buddhism, and the contemplative Christian practices that were being cultivated by Father Thomas and others, this kind of revival that's taken place in the West. I read The Cloud of Unknowing. I started to develop a reactivated interest in the mysticism of all traditions, and at that point a concordance formed for me between Christianity and Buddhism, and then I became much less interested in what the container was of anything, and much more interested in what the direct path was available to any person at any time to encounter the divine, either in a thou relationship or as an intrinsic I and a subject. And I realized that it's been made available to all of us. And just to wrap it up for me on that note, the other thing that emerged from that congruence and that circle completing, which is much more actually of a spiral going down and out in all directions. But when the circle completed, I became very interested in the developmental aspect, not only of my own Christian upbringing, but of Buddhism and any other religious system or spiritual system that I could think of. Because it's interesting to me that we don't expect for a 5-year-old human being to have the same worldview and the same method of interpretation as we would, say, a 50-year-old or a 70-year-old. And although age is not necessarily the greatest way to make this measurement, the point is that people change when they live and grow. And I noticed within Buddhism that was kind of an absent way of understanding our own religious system. And then I look back at my Christianity, and since then I've been very fascinated at taking developmental models in psychology or social systems and trying to understand how people develop and change within their religious framework and within their spiritual methodologies. So those are my big passions, but my day job is art.
Maybe you'd all be a little more comfortable. So, Stuart, I'm married. I have 4 adult kids, and my wife and I just welcomed our 4th grandchild into the world last Monday, who has way more hair than I do.
Just wait.
Yeah, that's what I said. I said it's going to take decades for this kid to get ahead, But anyway, my wife's name is Grace, and we live in Southwest Florida, a little island off the coast of the Everglades, or off the Everglades, called Marco Island. And how about you?
I live in Boulder, Colorado, but I'm actually moving to Amsterdam on September 1st, and I'm generally a nomad. I mean, I kind of live in hotels, but I would love to come and stay with you for a few months on your island. Thank you for the invitation.
Yes. I recommend it in the winter especially, although, in fact, I was just thinking, it's nice to have cooler weather. Anyway. How about you? Tell us about your...
I live in Los Angeles, right by Studio City. So I'm originally from Malaysia, born and raised there. Well, not raised, I was born there. And when I was 2.5 years old, we moved to Germany, and I lived there for almost 5 years. And then we moved to Egypt for almost 5 years. And then I moved to India for almost 5 years. And then when I was 18, my parents packed me off and said, okay, you're not doing music. You're going to do something useful with your life. We're sending you off to college to Illinois. So that's where I landed.
That's great. Okay. Here's a strange question. So we all get labeled. You get labeled Muslim. Before people might hear the word progressive, they hear Muslim.
Yeah.
I get labeled Christian. You get labeled
Freak.
But I guess you're labeled the Zen Buddhist.
Yes.
So what about your label do you love, and what about your label is difficult and frustrating?
Well, for me, what I love most about Buddhism as I experience it, which is different than how it's perceived, I'm sure. So I'll answer on both sides. What I love about it is that Zen is really not actually even a religion. It's not anything in particular except a set of experiments that you can conduct on your own consciousness. And so when I first encountered Zen, the reason that I fell in love with it was because a Zen teacher told me all beliefs are false. And I was very interested in that statement. I thought that was incredibly bold and bizarre. So we talked about it, and he said, just investigate it, find out. Here's some things you can do. These are methods, these are practices. Do these experiments for a few years, and then report back with your data. Share the data with other people who've conducted the same experiment, and see what you find out. You don't have to believe anything. And I said, well, what about, I'm really come from Christian roots. They're like, that's fine. This is not incompatible with that. Doesn't have any, what about my frolicking with Sufis? That's fine. This has nothing to do, it's totally compatible. So what I love about that label Zen is that it is all about the mystery, and it's not about knowing. It doesn't provide you with answers. It begs you into your own question. It invites you into your mystery and demands that you're the one who do the work. You're the one who live the question. And that's what I need. I know that's not what everyone needs or even desires, but for me, it kept me alive spiritually in my frustration with belief systems and their shortcomings and assets as well. Culturally, what I love on the, Zen in North America, to be a Zen Buddhist is a very funny thing, because Zen is what people plaster over anything that they want to equate with the word calm. Like, this is a Zen rock. This is a Zen garden. Doesn't this bathroom feel Zen? So I get a lot of comedic relief from that, and especially because my experience of Zen has been the opposite. It's actually increased the emotions in my life. It's increased my passion. I'm possibly a more troubled, agitated person in some ways than I was when I started practicing, because I'm in contact with the parts of myself that were dissociated before. So that's what I love about Zen.
Anything that's problematic about the label?
Just
or maybe you just said it, that it's associated with calm and that has
Commercialization.
Just that labels are always interpreted by whoever hears them, and you can't control how a person is going to interpret. Like I was saying about the developmental differences within every belief system, every person walking around on Earth is basically their own contained cosmology, and they interpret everything from that cosmology. And if you have no acquaintance with Zen and no relationship with a Zen Buddhist, then you will just project all of your own available contents onto the word Zen, and it's meaningless. But that's not a problem that's particular to Zen. I mean, I think that's true for Jesus or any other signifier that you could think of in a language. So,
well said.
Before I talk about labels, I just have to say this, like for you two men that are wearing pink, my idea that it takes a real man to wear pink. Especially this one. You're flaming. Right, so labels. As a Muslim, well, there is such a thing as a progressive Muslim, the jaw drops, the whole 9 yards. I think just me being myself, I allow people to get to know me as a human being first. And the fact that I'm Muslim is just, it so happens I'm a human being who practices a faith tradition called Islam. So I don't get bothered by it much. Actually, I kind of move on. I know that there's this very negative perception about what a Muslim believes in, but I think being at the forefront of the movement, I have also seen the change of perception of what a Muslim is, should be, and so on. So I see a real shift happening in front of me. So I don't feel too weighted by the labels. Yeah, everyone labels each other anyway, so.
That's good. I'll just say as a Christian, this is one of the big problems. In some cases, I would think in America to be identified as a Zen Buddhist people would be, you would be encountering a lack of knowledge that then gets filled in. I think it's almost the opposite problem with Christianity and to some degree Islam. We have a surplus of knowledge. that brings all kinds of assumptions that are highly problematic. And anyway, there's a lot, and there's a lot I'm sure people in this room could add to that. Pardon me?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I want to know, how did you guys end up being evangelical Christians? I mean, how for you in particular, and you were born into it basically, right? Mm-hmm. So, but how do you become, what about it that really attracted you into it? And I want to see compare that to the evangelical Muslims. You know, we can compare notes. So.
You want to go first?
Well, I was born into it, and the options were not presented to me until much later on. I mean, the short answer is I had a conversation with my church leaders when I was in about 8th grade or 7th grade, and I had some questions about, I just didn't understand if there was nothing outside of God, how anything that I could do or be could be a threat to God. And the conversation turned into an argument. This is in church with me and the pastors and one of the groups, and I basically was beat down verbally and just told, like, listen, stop.
Don't ask.
And don't do that again. Then I was taken aside and I was told, if you do that again, you really are not going to enjoy the results. They went and talked to my parents, and my parents pulled me aside and said, you're going to go to church until the day you graduate, and you can think and feel however you want about that, but you won't express that thought and feeling in that manner again. And so, you know, again, in retrospect, to be brought into an evangelical setting in that manner at the moment was very disturbing to me, but in retrospect, I kind of get it. I mean, I have daughters now. They're 9 and 6, and there are moments in given days when I don't want to infinitely discuss the receding questions of cosmology and belief systems. I think maybe my mom and dad were also like, we have to go to work, and we have to get you food, and we pay for this house, and we just happen to go to church, so deal with it, you'll figure it out later. And they were right.
What is reality? You know, something a lot of people don't understand, I think, is that wherever people identify themselves, that's where they are right now. And when I was a fundamentalist, I was not a fundamentalist, I was a Christian. And anybody else wasn't a legitimate Christian. And when I went from being fundamentalist to not using that word, like my church used that word. I remember the sermon where I'd never heard the word before, and somebody said, we're fundamentalists. And I thought, oh, okay, now I know. But then when I disassociated from that, and I had a situation that wasn't nearly as dramatic as yours, but I remember being in junior high school, I was really interested in two things that really ruined my life as a fundamentalist. Science and rock and roll. And I remember my Sunday school teacher, I think I was in 7th grade, and I was so interested in nature and wildlife and animals that as a kid, I checked out every book on animals and trees and wildlife from my public library, every single one in the children's section and every single one in the adult section. And then I found out that they had college textbooks in this one. And I read the college textbooks. I was memorizing the Latin names of trees and birds. I was just so into it. And when I was learning about evolution, I just thought, this is the coolest thing. This is so amazing that everything's related. And like looking back, for me, it was a spiritual thing. You know, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, and all those connections. I just thought this was wonderful. And I remember when my junior high teacher said, you have a choice. You either can believe in God or evolution. And I thought, okay, I'm 14 years old, whatever I was. I'll be 18 in a few years, and that'll be the end of this for me. And I just remember thinking, okay, note to self, as soon as I can get out of here, I will. And rock and roll just made it worse. Now I forgot the question.
What made you become an evangelist?
Oh, so for me, becoming evangelical was stepping into a more open space than fundamentalist. And I think people would be surprised how many Southern Baptists are actually kids who grew up IFCA, or some of you know what that is, or Southern Baptists grew up independent, primitive, double predestinarian Baptists, or how many people who are rigid, the most conservative kind of Presbyterians, well, they grew up fire baptized Pentecostal holiness, and so where people are very often is the most open place they can afford to be. The place where they get the most life that they're allowed to have without losing their parents and losing their uncles and aunts and so if they were given a real free choice, they wouldn't be there. It's the most they can negotiate without losing what they need to survive. And I think that's what was the case for me.
So I see some similarities, and so the difference is that I think the evangelical movement started, 50 years ago maybe, right, or longer, whereas the Wahhabi, which is the equivalent, the rigid Saudi version of Islam, really started propagating 25 years ago when the petrodollars started flowing in. So you see the Saudi influence of Islam every corner of the world, literally every corner of the world, and it's really detrimental to the soul of Islam. So I'm 50 years old. I know I don't look it, but 25 years ago, Islam was not crazy like the way it is now. I can tell you that. Trust me on that one. Now, in LA, you don't say that because that means you don't trust someone when they say that. But we're in a Christian environment, spiritual. 25 years ago, Islam was not crazy the way it is now. And it's going to take us another 25 years to dismantle that. And a lot of that has to do with the influence of Saudi money. Here in the United States, what used to be mosques where families could intermingle socially, it was not segregated. Now women have to enter through the back door, right? There's severe segregation. The Saudi interpretation of Islam has really permeated the mainstream thinking of Muslims, which is really problematic. And so you have this, and what's the first thing that goes in this is the arts. God forbid you're into music, because you know what, music, there's a spiritual path in music. And as a songwriter, musician, I totally get that. That's where God resonates for me, is in the music. And you look at the Taliban, the first thing they do is destroy the arts. They destroy the Buddhist the statues. You go to Nigeria, the first thing they did was burn all the old texts and any art form. It's so, I cannot explain to you how angry that makes me. But this rigidity comes from a place of ignorance, comes from a place of insecurity, comes from a place that when you're not secure with your own faith, you think everybody else is going to hell because you're right. And it's not just religion. These are people who tend to be very opinionated as well. It's like, I'm right, you're wrong. It's because they're not secure about sharing ideas. So.
Okay. I want to ask your permission to ignore you for just a minute.
Yes, please do.
Okay. Because Christians and Muslims have some work to do, right? But you just said something that is making me feel like I might say something that could be kind of interesting. Seldom happens.
You've been saying interesting things, so yeah. Okay.
No,
right.
Your comment about Saudi money fueling a Saudi version of religion.
Amen.
Does that ring any bells?
Great.
And so when you think about the Christian religion, I'll tell you a story that a lot of Christians don't know. Columbus, 1492. Columbus, did you know that there was a Left Behind novel series written in the 12th century? There was a guy named Joaquim de Fiore, and this had to do with Muslims because Muslims controlled the Holy Land. And Joaquim de Fiore and some others in his era read the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation in a very literalistic way that said that the return of Christ would happen when Christians got control of Jerusalem again, because then they could set up the monarchy. They were called the Quinto or Quinto Monarchians, because there would be the fifth great empire: the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire. Anyway, I'm missing one. The Babylonian Empire is in there, and the Roman was the last, and then would come the Empire of Christ. And Joachim had said that the king who would do this would come from Spain. Well, guess what? When Ferdinand and Isabella, they could tap into that, and Columbus could do some fundraising in that for his voyage. And so there was this whole thing behind that to say, if we can get a route to China to get the wealth of the East without having to go through the Middle East where all those Muslims make money on Chinese spices, we'll get the money to launch a crusade so that we can get control of the Holy Land and get the whole world under a Spanish king. And interestingly, it was money from the trade from the Far East that would get power to a political religious alliance to rule the world. We'll go forward to the whole colonial era, where we start with the Spanish and the Portuguese wanting to control the world, and then the English and the Dutch say, wow, we better get a piece of that action. So you basically have Catholic colonialism from the Southern Europe and Protestant colonialism from Northern Europe, capitalizing on it. Then it wasn't spices, it was slave labor and sugar and other products to fuel an empire to get control of the world. I mean, and then you think, what do we look at? What if there are these dimensions, and now it's oil and coal and so on, but it's petroleum-based economy that has all kinds of other impacts. And what if the conflict between Christianity and Islam, we ought to step back and not just talk about it as a religious conflict, we ought to talk about it as an economic battle. Wow, you brought it up, but that gets me thinking.
So what's really striking is the role of money and how that corrupts the system in general, and how that empowers the few, and how religion is also used to empower the few. You know, as much as I'm the head of a progressive Muslim movement, in so many ways, our philosophy has always been to break down that hierarchy. Our philosophy is to take money out of that system, because like Zen, it is really a spiritual path. It's just, Islam is about you and God. And that's not what Islam is right now. Islam is not supposed to have hierarchy, but what we do. So you have the Sunnis, they say there's no hierarchy, but the first thing they do is they always look at a sheikh, they look at an imam, and they say, what do you think? What do you think I should do? It's like they're always looking for that mediator. The Shia has also their mediator, the Ayatollah. Or just as a joke, some folks in our community call me the Anitollah. Gotta have some of it, right? So anyway, but what's really funny with Saudi Arabia is that Mecca was really a trading city, and people came from all over the world just to trade, and it was all about economics. It was about making money. And the whole system was based on trade and making money. There's nothing wrong with that. And what is really funny now is Mecca's still that. People come from all over the world. And it's like Las Vegas now, Saudi Arabia. It is no longer a spiritual space. And the overdevelopment and the amount of money that goes into it. So it's lost it's the genuine feeling of what Mecca was supposed to be, the pilgrimage practice. But what is really bothersome for me is that Saudi Arabia not only controls the economy of the world with its oil, but it also controls the Muslim world. Because when you want to go to Mecca, every country has a quota on how many of your citizens can go to pilgrimage. And they bloody well use that. And that's why a lot of Muslims don't speak up against Saudi Arabia. Because they don't want to be blacklisted. They want to go to Hajj. That's their goal. That's like the 5 pillars of Islam. One of it is going to Hajj. So that's the fear. That's the card that they play.
So back to you. When you hear a Christian and Muslim talking about this, what do you think?
Well, in Zen Buddhism, we don't struggle with the economic power resources that other... The sand is distributed very evenly at our seminaries. But I really appreciate this inquiry very, very much, because I think that to whatever degree we can begin to inquire and investigate our own spiritual systems and our own communities in the ways that we are enlisted, sometimes with, sometimes without our knowledge or consent, into the economic influences and manipulations. You know, the spiritual resource of liberating a human soul in Islam or Christianity, the freedom that's made available to every human soul, the magnetism of that is equal or greater to those who have a different agenda, which just, to me, is a long way of saying, if your end game is an economic or political or any way manipulating and controlling and divesting a planet of its resources and having control over a large number of people, you can't dispense with any religions or belief systems, especially the big, most influential ones. I'm always wondering whether through Christianity, Islam, or any other system that I interact with. I love people in every one of these systems. I love atheists, but I'm always looking for what is it behind the veil, what's behind the curtain, who else is moving levers. Everyone always wants the wheel. So I think one of the things that's really sparking for me, Anna, you brought up intermediaries, and I think one of the most dangerous and volatile things about a revolution or an evolution or a transposition of Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, any system we're in, is that when we remove the intermediaries and we have a direct access to the divine, to our own liberation, to each other. I mean, to me, God, a direct path to God is another person. If we really, really got into each other in that way, we would dispense with most of the influence that you two were just talking about so articulately. We would not have that necessity. So my first thought is just that I'm so glad you asked that question and have that curiosity, because it's something that we really don't hear about. It's something that's not investigated, and surely not by a perusal of television and print and most online stuff. I would love to hear this become one of the main questions of the next 10 to 20 years. And that you two will make that happen, right? And I can get my pom-poms.
I want to address about the direct connection with God, because Islam is about having that direct connection with God. And there is a passage in the Quran where it says, you know, God is closer to you than your jugular vein. And there's another saying that to know yourself is to know God. And so that is really powerful. And so Islam has become this, you know, ritual of directing prayer toward a something, when actually it should have been an internal exercise, a meditative. I mean, I don't know what happened in Islam. Prophet Muhammad got his revelation because he was meditating for days in a cave. What happened? How come we're not meditating in Islam?
Boy, we got a little bit of Zen action going on.
Well, that's a very interesting question, because Ani, my first big spiritual crush was the Sufi heart of Islam. When I went to, as a Zen practitioner, I went to a Sufi gathering, and it had never occurred to me, I was not aware that music could be a mystical practice, although it was mine.
Yeah.
I just didn't frame it that way culturally. I went to a Sufi gathering, and we spent 3 hours in musical absorption, where the music became the methodology for the sheikh being a tuning fork, and then tuning all of the other human beings in that room to this divine frequency. And it changed me forever, the love that I felt in that room as an experience. it is a language, it is a teaching, but it's musical, and those signifiers that don't come attached to any words, in my view, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this as a musician and an artist, that language to me is a great hope, because it's outside of the things that can usually grab and pull down sources of liberation. Whereas with language, we can be manipulated more easily than you can be hearing a symphony or in practicing musical meditation. So, double question. One, could you speak a little bit about music for you personally, and then in relation to Islam, and that perhaps you have some experiences with those Sufi sects that use it as a meditation? And then also, I would love to hear your thoughts about the divine feminine in the mix of all of this, because to me that's the big aching absence in this planet, in all of these systems.
So I'll start with the second answer for a question first. That's the easy one. So there's Muslims say this all the time, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. They say this before they do anything. Wake up in the morning, dress, eat, sleep, what have you, right? And it starts the beginning of every verse in the Quran. Now the word Rahim, the root word of Rahim is womb. Okay, because womb, that's where the fetus is sheltered, that is the most protected space, the most nourished space. And this is the characteristic of God, right? And what do? We totally butcher the meaning. We just say it, flippantly. We don't even mean what we say. We don't even, let alone practice that. Now, if we actually were Muslims in particular, if we were to actually reflect and meditate on what we're saying, that would itself take us to a different place. But the feminine characteristics of God is all over the Quran. But because of the way the Arabic is structured, it's a very male-dominated language. So if this is all women and there is one guy in a pink shirt, guess what? The noun becomes male, right? So that's the nature of the Arabic language. As far as music, I've been told that I was raised Sunni, although that's not how I identified myself, nor do I identify myself now as a Sunni. It's just like I'm a Muslim. But music, I've been told that I have a Sufi soul, and that's because of my inclination towards music. And earlier on I was speaking about how I use music as a spiritual way to connect with God. And there's sometimes when I sing, it's as if that I've just prayed 10,000 rak'ah. Rak'ah is where you prostrate, and I've just completed 10,000 of that. So I'm on a spiritual high when I perform sometimes. And as a Muslim in America, what I've started doing is creating spiritual songs in English, because Sufi is Turkish and Arabic and whatever other language, depending on the sect, depending on the tariqah that you're in. There's nothing that is really English, and so I started developing English ritual songs for us to spiritually connect with God.
Where do we find those?
I have a couple in my bag.
This might be a good time to say your website where people can...
My music website is a-n-i.net. And the Progressive Muslim Organization is M as in Mary, P as in Peter, V as in Victor, USA.org. So, yes, visit us.
Do you want to give a website?
Mine is stuartdavis.com, STUARTDAVIS.
Mine's McLaren.net. Okay, gosh, we only have a few minutes, and there's about 10 different directions I'd like to go in. But I want to talk about Jesus, because we've got, mostly Christian gathering here. And I want to tell a quick story relating to Buddhism and relating to Islam, and then I'd love to hear your response to this. After September 11th, I entered into a deep friendship with an imam in my neighborhood who was from the Ahmadiyya sect, which is a very interesting and sort of marginal sect. I think maybe the way a lot of Christians see Mormons is the way a lot of Muslims see Ahmadi. But we became very dear friends. And one day we were having lunch together, and we had been having interfaith talk, right? But I wanted to get a little more personal, and I said, Shamshad, can you tell me what you love about your faith? And you could sort of tell he hadn't really been asked that before, you know? And so he poured out his heart. It was very beautiful. Then he said, well, Brian, what do you love about Christianity? And I said, I really have a problem because I'm frustrated with Christianity. Could I tell you what I love about Jesus? And he said, well, sure. So I talked about what I love about Jesus. And when we finished, when I talked for a few minutes, he went like this. Oh, no. And I said, I'm sorry, did I offend you? And something he said, no. He said, I just realized I have never heard a Christian talk about what he believes. I have only heard Muslims tell me what Christians believe. He said, I didn't know you love Jesus. He says, I love Jesus too. And, you know, it reminds me of what you said about we turn our religions into belief systems instead of places where we talk about what we love.
The values.
Yes. And so I would like to ask you this question, Ani, if you could talk about, as a Muslim, your feelings about Jesus. And I'd like to say something in relation to Buddhism. So, as many of you, I don't know if he's here, but if you haven't had a chance to hear James Allison, in fact, I think he speaks right after this, but you really should hear James. James represents a group of Christian theologians. James happens to be Catholic, but represents a group of Christian theologians who are grappling with the work of an important French anthropologist named René Girard and a theory of human violence. It's very powerful, very provocative. I'm one who thinks it's extremely important because anyhow, this theory of human violence traces back to the issue of desire. And when you start reading the Bible along the question of desire, for all of my fellow fundamentalists here who know the Bible really well, you just start thinking about the issue of desire, and it just starts pinging up all over the Bible. And one way to talk about the Buddha is that so much of the Buddha's philosophy and view of life is about desire. And when you look at Jesus' teaching as a message about desire, when you look at the crucifixion in relation to the most fundamental desire, to stay alive, suddenly there are really interesting resonances. So I just wondered if each of you could say a little bit about, from your perspective, thoughts about Jesus.
Well, Jesus is a very important prophet in Islam. He is actually mentioned more than Prophet Muhammad is mentioned in the Quran. So a lot of Christians don't know that. But he's not, according to the Quran interpretation, he's not the Son of God. That's the difference between Islam and Christianity. But as far as his teachings, it's very extensive. The virgin birth. I mean, there's a lot of details in the Quran about Jesus. So for us as a progressive Muslim group, we actually celebrate Christmas. It's a prophet. It's if it's claimed that that's when he was born, even though it is, as we know, it's sort of shifted and it's culturally manipulated for economics. We know that, but still the spirit is good. And so in the spirit of brotherhood and sisterhood, we celebrate, the progressive Muslim community celebrate Christmas as well, not as a son of God, but as a prophet of Islam.
What a cool question. And I just also want to say thank you to you guys. I really appreciated being with you and feeling you and making new friends. Jesus, at the end of the day, first of all, I totally want to tweet what you said about rock and roll and science, because I think that's a t-shirt and it's going to be part of you getting your own island later. The thing about Christ for me is very much that rock and roll component. I mean, I'm basically down with anyone who is the full manifestation and the divine is inhabiting in them, and they overturn the tables literally and metaphorically of the extent systems and conditions that limit us from our own native endowment of freedom and God and love and mystery. So that's the first thing I would say about it. And then beyond that, just for me personally, the way that I relate and have a relationship with Jesus is it's very personal to me. I mean, I have a kind of personality type, I guess, that feels protective of Jesus. That sounds weird to say as a Zen Buddhist, but I definitely feel that ever since I was a 10-year-old kid, 11-year-old kid, one of my biggest issues was the manipulation and the shell game of using Christ and Jesus as a signifier to pull people in the exact opposite direction of what is at the core of that liberating entity and truth. So I feel very protective of it, and that means that behaviorally I tend to be private and have lots of one-to-one interaction with Jesus, and still, very interestingly, Jesus still pops up all the time in my meditation and dream life, which, you know, if you read the Buddhist manual, that's not in there. It's not supposed to be still happening, but it does. And so
Your parents raised you well.
apparently so. So that's my short answer, is that he's very much still alive personally and impersonally in the best sense. The last thing I think I would like to say about it is that I'm very much oriented toward the cosmic Jesus, the cosmic Christ. I know that I'm also an inhabitant of the cosmos, and that this planet, as miraculous and fantastic as it is one of a receding infinity that, in my understanding, is teeming with life, teeming with intelligence and mystery, and that Jesus is one of the great, to get back to the positive form of intermediary, I think that that's one of our great hopes for becoming cosmic citizens, is returning to the truth at that core of Christ. And I'm very grateful that it's here and available.
I wanted to say something really quick about being overprotective or protective of Jesus. I mean, as you know, there, in many of the Muslim communities, I mean, you can't say anything negative or funny about Muhammad and all hell breaks loose. But the truth of the matter is that, again, it's using a figure, and while you're saying Jesus, to pull away from something that was completely different from what Jesus taught. And the same with Prophet Muhammad. I mean, he was spit on and it was garbage thrown on him for a time, every single day. And when that garbage throwing lady stopped doing what she said, the first thing that popped in his head and the first thing he did was, oh, I hope she's fine. Right? And so here we have Muslims that are using the Prophet Muhammad as a tool, as their selling tool to take you away from the real character that he was, that was forgiving and humble, as was Jesus.
Our time is just about up. And they're just don't. I think we all wish we had a couple more hours and so on. But where will you be the rest of the time if people want to hear you?
Right. 8:30. I'm going to be at somewhere. You guys go first. I'll look it up.
Okay. And you're?
I'll be in Amsterdam if you guys want to come in.
Are you doing anything else at the festival, though? Okay. I can't remember what I'm doing tomorrow, but so right after this, I think, or shortly after this, I'm doing a thing with Krista Tippett over here, and then after that, I'm doing a book signing at the Jericho booth, which is near the performance tent. I think that's right. And then this isn't on the schedule. I'll do that from 4 to 5:30, and then at 5:30, I'm going to be back here with a friend, Pam Wilhelms, and we're going to talk about sustainable business and sustainable economy and regenerative economy. And some of the things that we were kicking around, we're going to explore a little bit deeper. So you'd be welcome to be part of that. I want to make a closing statement and then see if...
I know where I am.
Okay,
Okay, so at 8:30, I'm going to be at Dark Brew.
Darkwood
Brew, Unplugged.
Okay. 8 o'clock, and where is it?
Performance Cafe.
Performance Cafe.
Yeah.
Okay. When I am talking with you as a Christian, I feel like we really have similar problems. We have these religious establishments that have sort of rebranded what our originators had in mind, And in a strange way, although a lot of people try to pit Christians and Muslims and Jews as enemies, I feel like people like us are in the same boat because we're trying to rediscover what's at the essence and heart of our faith. I loved how you said it, what gets us out of the box. And you know, if we had time, we could talk about the history of Buddhism and how something very, very similar happened in Buddhism. I mean, if you spend time in Asia, and of course, being in Malaysia as a Muslim country surrounded by countries deeply impacted by Buddhism, you know, you might not realize this, but there is a whole Buddhist industrial complex too, with all kinds of fat statues and garish memorabilia that is as schlocky as any Christian
Gender
crap.
inequality.
Gender inequality.
Oh my gosh, yes.
That's right. And in some ways,
Amazing.
In some ways, the same problem is there. Although there's maybe here in America, there's less of the institutional struggle, but our different paths have very important and meaningful differences. But isn't it interesting how we have a very, very similar struggle?